Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds, digging into the story of Barapasaurus tagorei.
Ah, yes, the big-legged lizard.
Exactly. An early giant from India. We got a stack of scientific papers here. And, well, our mission is to figure out what makes this dinosaur so important.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the earliest known true sauropods, so it's key to understanding, how these massive creatures got started.
Right, how they evolved.
Mm.
And the story behind its discovery, it's pretty wild, isn't it? Like hundreds of bones, not just one animal, but a whole group found together.
Yeah, it's quite dramatic. It suggests a whole herd, maybe caught in some event. It gives us this incredible snapshot.
It really does. So where does the story begin, the actual finding of the bones?
Well, the very first bits surfaced back in 1958, but the main discoveries, the really significant ones, happened a couple years later in 1960, 1961,
Okay.
near Pachampali village, that's in central India, Maharashtra state.
So it wasn't just a single bone then. It was a proper site.
Oh, yeah, a whole bone bed. But it took a while for it to be formally described. That happened in 1975.
75, okay.
By Sohan Lal Jain and his colleagues. They were the ones who officially named it Barapasaurus tagorei.
And there was later work too, right? More detailed studies.
Yes, absolutely. Fast forward to 2010, and Bandyopadhyay and others published a really detailed osteological description. Basically, a super in-depth look at the bones themselves.
Like a bone-by-bone analysis.
Pretty much. It shows how our understanding keeps, getting refined over time. These things aren't static.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk about that name. Barapasaurus tagorei. It sounds impressive.
It does. And the first part, Barapasaurus, is quite literal. Bara means big in several Indian languages. Pa means leg, specifically in Bengali here.
Okay.
And then sauros, which is Greek for lizard, so big-legged lizard.
Makes sense. Was there a particularly big leg bone found early on?
Apparently so, yes. A large femur really stood out and inspired the name. You can picture it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Big-legged lizard. And the second part, tagorei. That sounds familiar.
It should. It's a tribute to Rabindranath Tagore, the famous Bengali poet and Nobel laureate.
Oh, wow. Why him?
Well, the timing was just right. The initial field work back in the early 60s coincided with the centenary of his birth.
That's fantastic. A connection between ancient life and, well, relatively modern culture.
It's a lovely touch, isn't it?
It really is. So these hundreds of bones, they all came from one specific layer.
Yes, that's right. All known Barapasaurus material comes from this single bone bed in what's called the Lower Kota Formation.
And how many bones are we talking?
Around 300 bones in total. And based on counting specific bones, like the left thigh bones, they figure there were at least 6 individuals there.
6 dinosaurs. Different ages, too.
Seems like it, yeah. Different sizes, suggesting different ages were represented in the group.
That is such a rich find for an early sauropod. It must give us a pretty good idea of what they looked like.
It really does. The skeleton is actually remarkably complete. We're missing the very front neck bones, the anterior cervicals, and most of the skull.
The skull's mostly gone.
Mostly, yes. But otherwise, it's one of the most complete early Jurassic sauropods we have. That level of completeness is gold dust for paleontologists.
No kidding. Now, you mentioned early Jurassic. How precisely can they date this formation? Is it straightforward?
Not exactly straightforward. That's actually a bit of a challenge. The Kota Formation doesn't have layers of volcanic ash right there, which are the usual go-to for radiometric dating.
Right. Those give you the really precise numbers.
Exactly. So instead, they have to rely more on biostratigraphy.
Which means?
Comparing the other fossils found in the same rocks, like other animals or pollen or whatever, to similar fossils found in other places around the world where the dates are better known. It's like putting together a puzzle based on relative ages.
Okay, so it's more indirect. What's the current thinking on the age, then?
The general consensus points towards the early Jurassic, specifically the Cinemurian to Planzacurian stages. That puts it somewhere around, say, 184 to 200 million years ago, roughly.
Roughly 200 million years. Wow.
But it's worth noting some studies have suggested it might be younger, maybe middle Jurassic, or even a bit later. So there's still some debate. It's an active area.
Science in action. Always refining. Okay, back to the bone bed itself. You said 300 bones, 6 individuals. Were they found alongside anything else interesting?
Yes, definitely. Mixed in with the bones were large tree trunks just scattered across the site, which covered about 276 square meters.
Big trees, like washed in.
That's the idea. And interestingly, while most bones were disarticulated, jumbled up, One specimen was found partially articulated.
Meaning some bones still connected.
Exactly, like maybe the ligaments hadn't fully decayed before burial, but mostly, yeah, it was a jumble. And the 6 left femora are the key clue for the minimum number of individuals.
So bones, trees jumbled together. Sounds like a story there. What do scientists think happened? How did they all end up there?
Well, the leading hypothesis put forward by Bandiopatier and his colleagues points to a catastrophic flood.
A flood, like a massive one.
Yeah, something powerful enough to kill a whole herd of these quite large animals, rip up big trees, and then dump them all together in one spot.
That sounds incredibly violent.
It would have been. The idea is the flood transported the carcasses and the logs, and then as they decomposed, the skeletons fell apart.
Okay, that makes sense for the jumbled bones. But you mentioned the skulls are mostly missing, right? You just have teeth. How does the flood explain that?
Well, that actually fits the flood theory quite well. Skulls, compared to, say, a big femur or vertebra, are often lighter, more hollow, maybe more fragile in some ways.
Right.
So the thinking is the strong water currents could have carried the lighter skulls further downstream, or perhaps they floated and were deposited elsewhere, leaving the heavier bones behind.
Gotcha. So the lack of skulls is actually evidence for the flood scenario.
Exactly. It's what we call taphonomy, studying how fossils form and what happens to remains after death. The pattern fits.
Fascinating. Okay, so this flood gives us this amazing collection of postcranial bones, everything but the head. What do these bones tell us about Barapasaurus itself? Did it already look like a classic sauropod?
Pretty much, yeah. Even though it's early, it definitely has that fundamental sauropod body plan. You know, the elongated neck vertebrae suggesting a long neck.
The iconic long neck.
Definitely heading that way. A relatively short, stout trunk. And importantly, strong, pillar-like limbs, columnar limbs. That tells us it was an obligate quadruped.
Meaning it walked on all fours all the time, no rearing up like some earlier relative.
That's the interpretation, yes. Built for 4-legged locomotion to support a large body.
And how large are we talking? You mentioned big-legged.
Yeah, it wasn't small. Estimates put it around 12 to 14 meters long, maybe something like 7 tons in weight.
7 tons. That's pretty substantial, especially for such an early member of the group.
It is. It's comparable to quite a few later sauropods. It shows that the trend towards, well, gigantism in sauropods started really early on. They weren't all small early forms.
Wow. So were the adaptations for supporting that kind of bulk already starting to show up in the skeleton?
Absolutely. The vertebrae, the backbone, already show features that became even more developed later. For instance, they had these things called hyposphene hypantrum articulations.
Hypo what now?
Yeah, hyposphene hypantrum. They're basically extra joints between the vertebrae that lock them together more tightly, adds rigidity and strength to the spine.
Like internal scaffolding.
Sort of, yeah. Crucial for supporting a long neck and heavy body. And another thing, the sacrum, that's the part of the spine fused to the hips, was strengthened. It actually incorporated a 4th sacral vertebra.
So an extra vertebra fused in there.
Right, providing a stronger anchor point for the hind limbs, which had to carry a lot of that weight. It's early evolutionary engineering for large size.
Incredible. Foundational work for becoming giants.
Yeah.
Now, what about the head? We know it's mostly missing, but we do have some teeth. What were they like?
We have, let's see, 3 whole teeth and 3 crowns. Not a lot, but something. The biggest is nearly 6 centimeters tall. They're described as spoon-shaped, which is pretty typical for many sauropods. They have wrinkled enamel, and interestingly, coarse serrations along the edges.
Serrations, like on a steak knife.
Kind of, yeah. These coarse serrations are seen as a more primitive or basal trait compared to some later sauropods that had smoother teeth. Maybe suggests they were processing tougher plant material.
Interesting. Gives us a tiny clue about their diet. Okay, so we have this fairly large early sauropod with some advanced features, but also some primitive ones like the teeth. Where does it actually fit in the sauropod family tree? Has that been easy to figure out?
No, not really. Its exact position has been debated quite a bit over the years. It highlights how tricky it can be to sort out these early evolutionary relationships.
Right, so what was the initial idea?
When Jane and colleagues first described it in '75, they didn't put it in a specific family. They noted it was clearly a sauropod, but also pointed out some features that seemed kind of pro-sauropod-like, more primitive.
So recognizes early, but its exact connections were fuzzy.
Exactly. Then, for a while, starting in the 80s, it was often grouped with another early sauropod called Volcanodon. They even created a family for them, the Volcanodontidae.
Okay, Barapasaurus and Volcanodon together.
Right. But later analyses, around the mid-90s, suggested that grouping wasn't natural. It was deemed polyphyletic.
Meaning they weren't each other's closest relatives, exclusive of other groups. An artificial grouping.
Precisely. It didn't reflect the true evolutionary branching pattern, so Volcanodontidae as a concept kind of fell apart.
Okay, so that idea was scrapped. Then what?
Well, the concept of Sauropoda emerged. That's the big group containing most sauropods, everything except the very, very earliest branches. And initially, Barapasaurus was placed inside Sauropoda.
Making it more advanced than Volcanodon, perhaps.
Yeah, it was the implication of some studies, yes, that it was sort of one step further along the main line of sauropod evolution than Volcanodon.
But I sense a but coming.
You sense correctly. The more recent detailed work, especially by Bandipatier and colleagues who did that big osteology study, they argued quite strongly that Burbosaurus is actually more basal than Volcanodon, that it should sit outside of Eusauropoda.
So closer to the root of the sauropod tree than Volcanodon is.
That's the current thinking based on their analysis, yes. It's seen as a very early branching sauropod, maybe even more primitive in some ways than Volcanodon.
Wow, so the view has really shifted back and forth.
It has. It really shows how science works. New data, new analysis methods, they can lead to major revisions in how we see these relationships. So now, cladograms, those evolutionary tree diagrams, usually show Barapasaurus near the base, along with Kotasaurus.
The one found at the same site.
The very same, found in the same Kota Formation. So Barapasaurus, Kotasaurus, Volcanodon. They represent this really early phase of sauropod diversification.
Fascinating. And speaking of the Kota Formation, what was the environment like back then? What kind of world did Barapasaurus inhabit?
The rocks themselves, clays and sandstones, suggest, river systems, floodplains, maybe lake shores, that sort of environment.
And it wasn't alone, obviously. Yeah. We know about Kotasaurus. Anything else?
Oh, yeah, it was part of a whole ecosystem. Besides Kotasaurus, there were several types of very early mammals found there, too, like Kotatherium, Indotherium, Indozostrodon. Tiny little things compared to the dinosaurs.
Early mammals living in the shadow of early giant dinosaurs.
Pretty much. And if you look at slightly higher layers in the Kota Formation, which might be a bit younger, you find even more diversity. There's a pterosaur, a flying reptile called Campylonothoids turtles, other reptiles like rhynchocephalians, relatives of today's tuatara, another type of lepisaur, more mammals.
So really diverse fauna building up in that part of the world during the early to maybe middle Jurassic.
Definitely seems that way. India was hosting a pretty rich ecosystem back then.
Amazing. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive on Barapasaurus, what are the big takeaways? What makes it so significant?
Well, I think it's fundamentally important because it gives us such a clear, relatively complete look at a very early stage of sauropod evolution. It shows that, many of the classic sauropod traits, the body plan, the adaptations for size, even significant size itself, were already present or at least developing very early on.
Right. They didn't start small and gradually get big. Some were big quite early.
Exactly. And the discovery context, that potential herd wiped out by a flood, is just incredible. It's a tragic scene, but it gives us this unique window into behavior and environment.
A frozen moment in time.
Sort of, yeah. And finally, the ongoing debate about its exact classification. That just highlights that paleontology is dynamic. We're always learning, always revising based on new evidence. It's not a finished story.
Absolutely. Keeps things exciting. Okay, so maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with, something to chew on.
Well, thinking about how Barapasaurus was already pretty large so early in the game, it makes you wonder, what was driving that push towards gigantism right from the start? Was it environmental pressures, escaping predators, accessing different food sources?
Or the initial advantages.
Exactly. And you also have to wonder, what else is still hidden in those Kota Formation rocks? We have Barapasaurus and Kotasaurus side by side. What other secrets about the dawn of the giants might still be waiting down there in India?
Food for thought indeed. What else might emerge from those ancient Indian landscapes? That's definitely something to ponder. Thanks so much for walking us through that.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating creature.
It really is. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on the Deep Dive.